Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins. How you doing, Lynn?
Hey, doing good.
We come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum, with interviews with historians doing that research, discussions about their sources and methods. Before we introduce today's guest, I'd like to ask a question. Lynn, were you ever in a school band?
Oh gosh, I was.
I
wasn't in marching band, but I was in, I don't know, you sit down and play band.
Yeah, like concert
band. I played
band,
the clarinet.
You played the clarinet?
Yes, I did.
Oh my God, I was a band geek as well. I played the bassoon, which is, I think, somehow nerdier than the clarinet.
It is.
I convinced my parents, they were like, oh, this is a very niche, specific instrument. And I convinced them that somehow it was going to get me a scholarship into college. That didn't pan out. But I asked that question because today we are talking about music in a way that we haven't talked about in a lot of ways, in sort of, and how it intersects with history in an important era in American history that I don't think is often talked about from this particular perspective. So without further ado, our guest today is Dr. Christian McWhirter. He is the Lincoln historian at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. McWhirter.
Thank you very much to both of you for having me. I played the flute in the concert band.
Oh, nice!
Not very well, and I didn't do it for long. So.
Yeah, I played the bassoon not very well, and I did it for a very long time.
That's better words, yeah.
So I personally have been a big Civil War nerd for quite a while, starting when I moved to Virginia. I became a huge Civil War nerd. So I've I've read a lot of books on the Civil War, and this is definitely one topic that I feel like I have not heard much on. So I was really excited about your research. So do you want to talk a little bit about what exactly your research is? And a question you ask in your book that I really liked, which was the American Civil War the first war fought to music?
Yeah, thank you. I've been researching and writing about music in the Civil War for longer than I care to admit at this point. And that kind of culminated in a book I published called Battle Hymns, The Power and Popularity of Music in the Civil War. And it's kind of like you. I'd always felt that music, I was really into, I'm really into popular culture in general, but I'm also really into the Civil War. And there always seemed to be this intersection of the way we represented the Civil War as having lots of music, and it was always the same songs. And once I started digging into it, it was one of those things too, though, where you're like, oh, someone's probably already written about this, and musicologists had written a lot about it, but there wasn't a lot of work on like the way people experienced music in the war, the way they used music in the war. And yeah, the short answer is I started digging into it. I started looking at letters and diaries and periodicals from the time and newspapers and things like that, and uncovered that music was everywhere during the Civil War. And it occurred at a moment when the American music industry had just started to come into its own. And so it plays this like vital kind of psychological, moral, social, cultural role during the Civil War, which is why, yes, I kind of summarized. So thank you for in saying it was like the first war fought to music. Music was just a constant during the American Civil War.
It's so funny that you say music industry. I would have thought like folk music, right? Like that, but that doesn't necessarily imply sort of a system behind it or like an economic model surrounding it. That's super interesting.
Right, like the folk tradition, or what we call folk, where people are passing songs to each other orally, right? They're singing them and they're learning them from each other. That is still certainly around and plays a role in the way music is kind of spread and performed during the Civil War. But in the mid 19th century, music, especially here in America, music becomes a commodity. Music becomes just another thing for, capitalism to get its hands on. And so the manufacturing and selling of musical instruments becomes really big in the United States. In other countries, pianos in particular were much more expensive, but in America, they begin manufacturing their own pianos. And so you're able to, middle class families are able to buy pianos, is where in other parts of the world, like Europe, only the elite could own pianos. And, one of the things about 19th century Americans is they're always really eager to brag about American egalitarianism, but they're also constantly mimicking whatever the aristocracy in Europe are doing, right?
Yeah.
And so they want these pianos because it's a sign of being refined. And so these pianos start to get purchased. And then once you start getting pianos in the home, in their parlors, then all these other industries rise up around them, right? Because then you have to feed these people music, and then you want to make money off that. And so all the sheet music industry explodes around this explosion of musical instruments you can buy, right? That's how people would actually buy songs back then, is they would buy these pieces of sheet music, bring them home, and they would have like colorful covers on them and things like that would attract you to buy them. They'd perform them. All these music teachers sprout up everywhere to teach people how to play these instruments. And so that becomes, and then this whole group of songwriters emerges to feed music to this whole industry. And this is all during the 40s and the 50s. So like the Civil War occurs right when this is a huge deal. And so America turns to this music industry as a way to engage with the war. So it's kind of perfectly timed in that way.
Yeah.
That's an interesting dynamic. I can see some other places where, when whatever system enters the home, like that's when the thing becomes commodified. Like when it can be like mass produced and mass marketed. That's actually interesting. I've never thought about that dynamic specifically, but it's interesting to see it happen in a place. I can think of it as sort of like computers, really, as a parallel, even though it's very different. But it's interesting to think about it in such a low tech situation. Like they just had an instrument in the house now. So people need to use it. You got to justify that piano somehow. So you got to teach yourself how to play or get a teacher and purchase music to learn new songs. Interesting.
Right. I mean, one of the kind of core components, I guess, to kind of build on what you just said, I don't say this in the book, but like, when something becomes a big deal in the American market is when like the white middle class accepts it, right?
Right.
And so that's what happens in the mid-19th century. The white middle class gets interested in music, and suddenly the music industry, explodes around them, right? So
yeah. This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primary source media. That's patreon.com/primary source media. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show.
So I don't know if you'll know this, but you're talking about pianos, so I want to mention Isaac's favorite earlier instrument, the harpsichord.
Oh, God.
And he hates it.
I hate the sound it makes.
Was the harpsichord, I feel like that was more elite, or am I misinterpreting that? And I guess it just kind of fell out of favor, and then they didn't make them in the U.S., and we went to pianos. I'm just wondering what happened to the harpsichord.
Yeah, I think, you're right. You're a little outside my wheelhouse here, but yeah, I think that the harpsichord's moment is earlier than the mid-19th century. The other thing that's happening, the reason why pianos are sexy in the mid-19th century is because they're evolving at that time as well, right? So if you look at the way like pianos look then, they're kind of boxier, right? They're not uprights. Uprights are right around that same time too, but they kind of have these boxy kind of pianos, but they're developing into more what we think of as a grand piano, right? Steinway is founded during the Civil War. So like pianos are also kind of sexy because they're evolving. The other kind of music trend, when I talk to kids here at the museum about Civil War music, I always try to get across to them that like the really cool music thing in the mid-19th century is brass bands. They're also really into brass bands. So that's the other part of it that isn't so much about the home, but has more to do with immigration and culture, right? Because all these Germans are migrating into the United States. And the brass band tradition is this really trendy thing in Europe that's particularly associated with the Germans. And they bring that with them. So all these communities are also developing these like local brass bands. And that's why when the Civil War breaks out, we haven't quite gotten to the war yet in our conversation, but that's why when the Civil War breaks out, there's all these regimental bands you hear about, right? All these units have these bands with them. Well, that's why, because that was like the cool thing to have. It would be like having,
Oh.
you know, Taylor Swift come with your regiment off to war. Was to have a brass band with your
Everyone
regiment,
wants to
right?
fight with them. Yeah.
Right.
Be a part of that.
So that's the story there too, right? We don't think of these things now as being like cool or trendy, but yeah, pianos and brass bands are really cool in the 1860s.
I never thought I'd hear that.
Right. Right.
So as far as songs go, I'll admit that most of the songs that are popular during that, I don't know, I'm asking, you know, which ones were popular, but ones that I'd heard until I moved to Virginia, I really hadn't heard music from the era. And then I moved to Virginia and suddenly it's like Dixie everywhere. And, you know, I'm hearing all these songs and like, why did I never hear these in Pennsylvania? They're very Southern, I suppose, but I'm wondering, are these the kind of songs that you still hear? Were those the ones that were popular, or were there ones that we've never heard of that were popular, and these other ones just, for some reason, stuck in our memory from earlier or later?
And if
Especially
you could,
Dixie.
I'd like you to sing them as well.
Yeah. So I get asked that all the time. Everybody assumes that I'm interested in this topic because I'm really musical, and or that I'm really into this music. That's the other thing. Is like people think that like they'll come up to me after I give talks, and it's wonderful. Like I don't want to make fun of them. Like it's wonderful, but they're like, yeah, don't you really love the way, you know, insert name of some group I've never heard of, like interprets Dixie, and like, you know, and I saw them at Gettysburg last year, and like I won't know who they're talking about. Like I am very interested in music, but I don't listen to this music, you know, for fun all the time per se.
You mean you don't have one of those machines that will play it on like a wax cylinder?
Yeah,
at your house? No.
That'd be awesome.
It happens a lot. You said you like tangents, so here's like you said. It happens a lot when I describe what I just talked about too, with like parlor pianos and stuff. Is when I give talks or I talk to the public about it, I get a lot of people who come up to me afterwards and they're like really nostalgic for that because they've like grown up with it, and so they'll think that I'm advocating for like a return to that. So they'll be like, "Wasn't it better when we would all gather around the piano in our parlors and we would sing songs?" And like, I always try to meet them halfway. We're like, you know, it's true. Like families don't do that as much anymore. And that was probably really nice. But on the other hand, if you like told any of those people, like say Abraham Lincoln, that like you could put a little box in their pocket that would play every song they ever loved whenever they wanted, they would take that deal. Right. And so, but anyway, I'm off topic here. You asked about
my mother-in-law is a parlor piano advocate.
See, there you go, right? Yeah.
And
it's lovely.
I know what Jenna's talking about.
Too, but
it's nice. She sings a lot when she comes to visit.
Well,
and
see,
things,
that's
but like
awesome.
we don't like. I don't try to participate because it would just it would ruin it. But Lynn did ask an interesting question. Are the ones that we think of today, is that what was popular at the time? Like, do those?
Right. It's a little column A, a little column B. Like one thing we can talk about later if you want, Lynn, is why these songs are more prevalent in the South, because they are, and there's reasons for that, I think. And it's not an accident. You know, growing up, I mean, I was always interested in the Civil War, so I'm probably not your average sample, but like, you know, watching, you know, Civil War films, you know, watching the Ken Burns miniseries, those kind of things.
Oh yeah.
You do hear the same songs over and over again, and it tends to be. You mentioned Dixie, you know, always Dixie for the South. Songs like the Battle Cry of Freedom, you hear a lot. The big song for the North is usually the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Right, we hear a lot. We all know that song. Other songs like Marching Through Georgia, Tenting on the Old Campground. You know, there's kind of this corpus of Civil War songs that we hear over and over again. And that was one of the things I kind of set out to discover, right? Because there'd been a lot of work previous to me, really good work previous to my work, on the songs themselves. And, you know, like what's in these songs, how are they, you know, this sheet music stuff I talked about, like how were they distributed? What were they all? There's books that just give you like almost every song published during the Civil War and a little bit of info about them. You know, people had done that work. But I was curious, but were these songs really popular? And so that's one of the reasons I looked so closely at what people actually said at the time. And I tried to record every time they mentioned a song. And what I uncovered was that mostly we're right. Mostly the songs that were important to them at the time are the ones that we tend to remember. So, you know, Dixie was by far the most commonly performed song in the South. The Bonnie Blue Flag was kind of the other big one in the South. In the
Yep.
North, the Battle Cry of Freedom was performed a lot. The kind of hook, when I pitched the book to my publisher too, this was one of my hooks, was I uncovered that the Battle Hymn of the Republic really was not very popular. It was almost never performed during the Civil War. In the Civil War, they're performing, or the Battle Hymn of the Republic is just a revision of an older song,
Right.
which is itself the revision of an older song. But the song the Battle Hymn of the Republic is rewriting is a song called John Brown's Body, which is kind of much cruder and also much more directly associated with an abolitionist. That was performed far more than the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Interesting.
Was that relatively common? Because I know of one other instance where an earlier song was rewritten, like the lyrics were rewritten and reworked to make sense for the Civil War. I think there was a song that was a folk song from the Indiana sort of area that was written about the Battle of Fallen Timbers, Lynn, and during the Northwest Indian War. It happened to take place on the same date or something like that, like November 4th, and so it was like repurposed for to commemorate the Civil War.
It's like the same melody but different words.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. And that happens all the time. So you mentioned the folk tradition, right? That's where the folk tradition is still manipulating things because all these songs are being constantly rewritten. So, and both professionally and like on the spot, right? So, the Battle Hymn of the Republic is a really good example where you have it's this old revival song called Say Brothers, Will You Meet Us on Canaan's Happy Shore, that this Massachusetts regiment turns into this song called John Brown's Body to kind of tease one of their members that he has the same name as the abolitionist. And then people try to refine it and all these new versions get written. The Battle Hymn of the Republic gets written, right? And, other songs are similar. So the Bonnie Blue Flag is set to a melody of an old song called the Irish Jaunting Car. When Johnny Comes Marching Home, that's another big Civil War song that everybody knows. I was never able to determine, and I don't think we've really figured out even where that melody came from, but that melody pops up in several different Civil War songs and may even go as back to English. There may even be old Scottish and English songs to that melody that people are just adapting.
Oh, wow.
So there's a lot of that going on. Of course, the national anthem is also adapted from another melody, right? So this is a common 19th century occurrence, but it really goes, all these things, goes into overdrive in the Civil War. But the other thing you mentioned, Isaac, you mentioned when these singing sessions can potentially go on in your house, you don't participate, right?
Right, yeah.
The other element that's influencing all this music is everybody's participating in the 19th century because there's no recorded sound.
Right.
So everybody who is in the Civil War, in that period, is not at all embarrassed or ashamed to sing out loud at any given time because that's how music is being created and participated in, right? And what that does is it eliminates the kind of idea we have today of there being official versions of songs. So what I'll tell people when we talk about this is I'll tell everybody to close their eyes, and depending on how old they are, I'll pick a song. So I'll say, think about She Loves You by the Beatles, right? And we all just psychically had a link where we all just heard exactly the same song in our heads at the same time, right?
Right.
Probably. And that was not possible in the 1860s because there was no radio and there was no recorded sound. Sometimes the people who produced these songs never even really performed them publicly, right? Stephen Foster is the most popular songwriter in America, and he did not perform his own songs. So you wouldn't even have a common frame of reference. So what that did is it gave you ownership over the song. You felt comfortable doing whatever you wanted to it. And so a lot of these songs that are popular during the Civil War, what I found is, though, when people are performing them, they're making all kinds of changes to them at any given time. Often just to be goofy or whatever, but often to express ideas, right? And so I don't think it's coincidental either that the songs we're talking about are political. Dixie's political, the Bonnie Blue Flag is political, John Brown's Body is political, the Battle Cry of Freedom is political. Those are the kind of songs they wanted to perform and they wanted to hear because they're trying to make sense out of why this war is happening, what's their participation in it, those kind of things, right? They're using music and then they're interacting with music to do that.
It seems like it was so much more personal. It's now music is done to us, but everybody created music. So it was more, personal to each individual.
Communal, yeah.
Yeah, which is really,
cool.
really interesting.
Right, it's both at the same time, right? Simultaneously communal and individual, because you have ownership over your performance, right? All of us
Right.
can be the performer at any given time, and then
Yeah.
that allows you to do whatever you want, right, with the song. But you're also around actual people who are either performing with you or are listening to you, and then they could take control at any given time, right?
Yeah.
So John Brown's Body is the best example of that. Like, if in case anyone's unfamiliar with the song, right? John Brown's Body just repeats the same line 3 times. Right, so the first verse is John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, and they just say that 3 times, and then they say his soul is marching on, and then the glory hallelujah chorus, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like, and that's how it gets written down. But the way all these soldiers remember it is that the lyrics just change all the time, because all you have to do is come up with one line that you can repeat 3 times to that meter, and then you sing the chorus, right? And there's one person, I forget, is it Oliver Wendell Holmes, says after the war, that song never ended. And that's what he means. What he means is when they were on the march, they would sing this song, they would sing John Brown's Body, and they would just constantly just make up new lyrics, right? And depending on how you felt at that time or what you wanted to get across, those would be whatever, right? And you could just do that forever. So that's what they're doing, right? They're not performing these songs in like a professional, like, oh, I got to make sure I get it right kind of way. These guys are all manipulating it and doing whatever they want, right?
Yeah, that's so funny. There's I understand that dynamic very viscerally, because I have an 18-month-old son, and he's really he finds the ants go marching song very funny for us to like march around and do stuff, even when we're like getting him ready to go or whatever. But neither my wife or I know the words, and we have not looked them up, like what the real words are. So like the little one stopped to whatever it is, like we just make it up every time we do it. And it's become like a game where we'll try to come up with a new lyric every time we do a thing, or a new rhyme. So I get that. I get that. That's actually super, super interesting.
Isn't the ants go marching when Johnny comes marching home? Isn't it that melody?
Yes,
right.
Yes.
So there you go.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Yeah, right. It's like we're 3 derivatives away from the version they were singing during the Civil War. That's but wild. So did it get more? So you have all this stuff going on, and this is kind of, you said, in the 40s and 50s, becoming popularized. It did. How did the Civil War change things? Like, was that when that began? Did that sort of make these things political? Were they political beforehand? Did they, what was the dynamic during the war itself, or going into the war?
That's like, to a certain extent, that's my whole book. So I gotta think. I'll be narrow about it. I think the biggest change it makes is the presence of armies, right? So the other thing we have to remember when we're talking about culture in the Civil War is that it is in fact a war, right? And so what happens when the war breaks out is you have all these, mostly men who have lived in disparate parts of the North or the South, and they all come together into these huge military units, right? Often close to, early in the war especially, often close to urban centers, right? So these armies are forming near Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, and New Orleans, and, places like that. And they're bringing all these song traditions. They're bringing their willingness to sing with them that I mentioned earlier, but also all these song traditions with them. And what I found was the armies basically act like a concert tour would today, where like whatever, they're literally these like mobile units going all over the place, singing songs, and wherever they're singing these songs, people are hearing them and then adopting them. So soldiers become the kind of engine through which songs get popularized in the Civil War. And I found a few kind of intellectuals commenting on this, that like, what's happening is the soul, and like some people are mad about it, right? Because there's also all these people, this is just around the time when high and low culture, so-called high and low culture, are starting to differentiate. And like the high culture people spend the whole war just apoplectic that these like marching tunes and these funny songs are what's super popular, when these people should be listening to like Mozart or something, right?
Clearly the most important thing for them to be upset about at that
during the Civil War, that's the issue.
And I'm not kidding. There's this whole Dwight's Journal of Music is like the biggest music journal at the time, and that's all they write about is how upset they are. You're totally right. They never write about,
all the people being killed
or anything. Yeah,
the priorities exactly where they should be. Right.
It's like, oh, all the men in New York. Like, I'm again not kidding. It's like, oh, all the men in New York have gone off to fight in the war. So, like, nobody's going to the theater. What's going to happen to American culture? It's like, well, that's the point.
I've been part of a couple. I used to work in theater when I was first out of college. I was in a theater in New York, and
sure.
I have been in a part of conversations that are not that far from that. To be honest, like, that was uncomfortably close to home. They're like, "Oh my god, I can't believe this tragic event happened. Do you think it'll affect tickets? Like, what are we thinking? Yeah, what are we thinking?"
Right. So
I
so there's a lot of that. But yeah, and that's also why I talk about political. I think it's why political content matters, because I think that's what soldiers want to sing about.
Yep.
I think there's also this whole obverse kind of thing going on too, where there are a lot of songs that come out during the Civil War that are written from the point of view of a soldier. So like a good example is there's a song that's mostly popular in the North called "Just Before the Battle, Mother," which is about a soldier who's like about to go into combat, and the things he's thinking about right before combat are like how much he loves his mom and how he hopes he fights really bravely, right? Mm-hmm. And what I found was like soldiers aren't singing this song. And they're probably not thinking that either, right? But they're probably thinking right before battle is like, how am I going to get out of this, right? Like they're not thinking, they might be thinking about their mom a little bit, but like the people who are going out and buying Just Before the Battle, Mother are moms who then take it home and perform it because that's what they want to think their guys on the front lines are thinking about, right? So there's this whole obverse going on too, where the soldiers have these songs they like and that they're singing, but there's also this whole kind of market of songs for the home front that is kind of about what you wish the soldiers were thinking about or what they were singing, right?
That's neat.
Yeah, I mean, you have to smooth over the whole thing for the general audience somehow, right? You gotta make it feel like everyone's got own. Yeah, everyone's fighting for the right reasons,
Right.
So I'm wondering, in the South, you have a lot of enslaved people who are with the army, and were they singing their own songs? Were there like songs that they perhaps brought over from Africa, but then were taken by soldiers and rewritten, or like were they singing the same songs? Because if you want to sort of explain what Dixie is about, I was surprised when I first learned, at least the description about that it's supposed to be an enslaved person who wants to get back to their plantation, which was sort of struck me as I didn't realize that's what this song was about.
Yeah.
I was like, wait, what?
Yeah, you touched on a couple of things there, Lynn. Yeah, so there's like, when we talk about black music during the Civil War, we have to kind of talk about actual black music that black people are performing.
Right.
And minstrelsy, which is one of the most popular genres of music in America at the time, but is entirely based upon white people painting themselves up in blackface and performing comically what they think the music of African Americans is like. And of course, minstrelsy is it's not just music, it's a whole stage performance. But, minstrelsy, if we want to start with minstrelsy before we get to actual black music, minstrelsy is kind of the first popular art form in the United States, at least to come from white people, which again, I realize this is all very complicated because they're pretending to be black people, but that becomes, kind of an original American art form and that exports itself to other countries. Like minstrelsy becomes an international phenomenon. And it starts here, and it's enormously popular. It's not, I don't think it's quite the most popular genre of music going into the Civil War, but it's a big deal. I mentioned Stephen Foster before, right? Stephen Foster is the first American songwriter to make a living off of songwriting alone. And he writes all these famous minstrel songs, which are all, we learn them in school still and stuff. I don't know if they still do, but when I was a kid, and I grew up in Canada, I would learn some of Stephen Foster's songs. He wouldn't sing them in dialect, but songs like Oh Susanna and Camptown Races and My Old Kentucky Home.
For sure.
Those are all Stephen Foster songs. Those are all minstrel songs. Those are all songs that are supposed to be performed in blackface and from the point of view of an African American who is, like you said, in most part, happy to be enslaved or is away from being enslaved and wants to go back. And so Dixie is the most popular minstrel song of the Civil War. And it's written by one of the founders of minstrelsy, this guy named Daniel Decatur Emmett. Daniel Decatur Emmett was most famous for being the guy, although these things, the people get credit for doing things first. These things are always in the air. So I don't know if he was actually the first, but the thing he gets credit for is to be the first guy to decide that, like, a minstrel troupe is a good idea. So, like, what's better than one white guy in blackface? A bunch of white guys in blackface, right? That was his innovation. So
can't imagine the board meeting when that guy. Goodness.
Yeah, that was his pitch on the whiteboard.
Yeah, right. It'd be like, hear me out.
If one is good.
What if?
Yeah. I think minstrelsy is actually really hard to like wrap my head around. I knew when I was growing up, I knew it was a concept, but generally speaking, but if anyone wants to sort of like get a good picture of what this sort kind of could look like, there's an episode of Mad Men where I think Roger Sterling's daughter is getting married or something like that. Where the character Roger Sterling does a minstrel song in blackface.
What?
And to us, a party of essentially like very rich white people. But it really is like a striking thing, and just it will rub your modern sensibilities the wrong way when you see it. But it was probably a valuable for them depicting it in that it showed how people responded to these kinds of things, and that it was popular that's all the way in the 1960s. So this is we're talking way earlier than that, but it's an interesting thing to visualize what that would look like, because you don't see it very often.
No, and it's important to note that Mad Men is in the 1960s, because I do know, I mean, again, I'm a historian of the 19th century, but minstrelsy doesn't go away until the mid 20th century. So minstrelsy lasts over 100 years as a accepted art forms. Like, even as the civil rights movement is starting, there are still white people performing in blackface. Like, it has a real longevity. It waxes and wanes. But yeah, it sticks around for a long time. And it's still embedded in our culture in all kinds of different ways.
For the record, no one is upset that Roger Sterling does this in the show. It's not like he does it and there's like a big uproar. Like, everyone thinks it's very entertaining.
Which is what's so shocking for the viewer.
Yeah, it's just weird. It just feels uncomfortable. It's odd.
Right.
But that's I had no idea that those songs were originally minstrel songs. That's I do know all the words to.
No idea.
Right. And if you read them at the time, so the way they're originally written, and I'm not going to say any of it now, but they're written in what then they would call Negro dialect. I'm putting air quotes in the air if you can't see me. And they're written in a way that comically mimics the way they thought African Americans spoke. So also embedded in those songs, we don't do, when we perform these songs now, they're not usually performed that way, but even the very language they were using was designed to belittle the intelligence and culture of African Americans, right? So racism, minstrelsy on the surface, the way they sold minstrelsy on the surface is this is a celebration of, right? Look, we have all these enslaved people here in America, and they're so interesting, right? And they have this culture, and so we're going to show you what that culture is like by performing it on stage, right? That's kind of that's the PR, that's minstrelsy's PR, right? But yeah, every aspect of it is just completely, drenched in white supremacy, right? The other thing minstrelsy is it's doing minstrelsy is super complicated, and we could do a whole episode just on minstrelsy. So it's doing a bunch of things at once, but at any time, it's never not reinforcing white supremacy, right? It's always reinforcing that this idea that white people are smarter and more cultured than African Americans, right? That's always just implied in every aspect of minstrelsy. So that's still going on in the Civil War, and it's a big deal. And everyone is participating in it. It's not just, in fact, it's probably what people would assume is white Southerners are way more into minstrelsy than white Southerners, because slavery's in the South, right? So you would think racism is worse there. And it's actually the opposite going into the Civil War. Because there are less black people in the North. And so in the North, they
Oh,
buy Minstrelsy's PR, right? They're like, this is
right.
awesome, right? Look at this exotic thing, right? Where we can see what these enslaved people are like, who we don't really encounter. Minstrelsy is much less popular in the South. Ironically, as the war goes on, I found all these Southerners who suddenly start thinking minstrelsy is great. Because as they're African American, as the African American people that they think, are happily enslaved, as those people begin fleeing and resisting their enslavement, all of a sudden, white Southerners really want to hear these Stephen Foster songs about how happily enslaved African Americans are, right? And so,
Right.
there's a dynamic there too that's kind of interesting, which leads into what you were asking about, Lynn, too. Then with like what are Black people actually performing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the other thing you asked me earlier, like what makes the war change American music? Another big change that happens for the history of American music during the Civil War is all these white people who lived in the North who had never really encountered enslaved people or had like barely encountered African American people in their daily lives. Or if they hadn't really engaged with their culture very deeply. They suddenly start going into the South, like especially these abolitionist missionaries in places like South Carolina, in the Sea Islands and places like that. They go down and they start interacting with what we call freed people, right? Like enslaved people who were either contrabands or had won their freedom, and they start hearing them perform music, and the music they're hearing is nothing like minstrelsy, right? And so they have all these different reactions to it. So
Right.
and this is happening to U.S. soldiers too as they enter the Confederacy. And so I found this one soldier who writes home to his mom because he's encountering enslaved people as he makes his way through the South. And he's his brain cannot compute that they don't know Stephen Foster songs. And so he writes to his mother how he's asking them all about these Stephen Foster songs and they don't know them. And he just can't, his brain just can't understand that minstrelsy's fake, right? He just can't get past it. So there's people like that, right? So there's a fascination there with Black music, but it's also being resisted by no, I want my white supremacist version of this, right?
Right.
But then you get these missionaries who hear this music, and they do the opposite, where some of them are realized this is almost an anthropological thing, right? They've uncovered this music. They think they've uncovered this music that nobody's heard before. And so they want to start writing it down. They want to start recording it because this is
nobody's heard before.
Exactly.
Right, well, exactly,
as they're watching people perform it currently.
Yes.
Exactly. Right. Right. And so they want to, and right. So which is also interesting. So so I haven't really talked much with the music itself. So the music that they're writing down. So and unfortunately, because, of course, African Americans in the South weren't allowed to write down, most of them were prevented from being literate. And even if they were literate, the white media and places like that weren't really interested in what they had to say. So we don't have a lot of actual African American people telling us what their music was like. There's a bit decades later in the WPA slave narratives where they're remembering maybe what it was like, but we don't have a lot of contemporary African Americans in the 1860s telling us what they're singing. We have a few, but not many. What we mostly have to do is see this music through the lens of these white people who encounter it. Right. And what they tell us is that it's this tradition that we now call, for a while they called them, Black, or again, scare quotes, Negro spirituals, right? That tradition comes from the Civil War, songs like Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, or Go Down Moses is a Civil War song. Most people don't know that. Go Down Moses is a Civil War song about these, it sprouts at a contraband camp in Fortress Monroe in Virginia. And what these again, quote unquote contrabands are singing about is their freedom, right? That Moses is going to go down to Egypt's land and let my people go. Well, that's the U.S. Army, right? Going down and freeing enslaved people, right? And so that song comes from Fortress Monroe. So that's the kind of songs they're singing. They're also sometimes called shouts. So it's this really loose improvisational style of music is what they're performing, which resists European style notation. So part of the irony of what these people are these white observers are doing. So they care about this music and they want to preserve it and they want to popularize it, But the moment they write it down, they do violence to it, right? Because they're making it conform to European, like, ideas of notation and meter and all that kind of stuff, which, Lynn, you mentioned, African styles of music and things like that. Like, that's also influencing this music, and that doesn't really conform to those traditions. So, like, almost as soon as they wrote those songs down, they preserved them for us, but they also didn't, because we're never going to know. I mean, we don't have recorded sound anyway, but we only get them through the lens of how they wrote them down, right? So they both succeeded and they failed in communicating this music to us, right? But that's also what's going on. And then when they join the U.S. Army, right, there's this whole then phenomenon where then some of these freed people join the U.S. Army, or people who are already, African Americans who are already free in the North join the U.S. Army. And then, like all these other soldiers we've talked about, they start singing too. And what I found with them is they're singing a mix of both things. So they're singing their own songs, right? Songs that come from the traditions that they're used to. But they also adopt the kind of popular, quote unquote, white songs of the war, like the Battle Cry of Freedom and John Brown's Body. No surprise, they're particularly fond of John Brown's Body.
Yeah.
Not hard to figure out why. Yeah. And then they start singing these songs a lot too. And again, they're changing the lyrics or they're writing their own versions. But they're kind of trying to do both things. And I think all this is intentional, right? We're only getting the songs that Black people are performing when they know white people are listening, right?
Exactly.
And so I think that's a dynamic to remember too. They're selecting which songs to perform to try to influence their white listeners.
Yep.
And they want to prove to their white listeners that they are, intelligent, that they want their freedom, that they're willing to fight to destroy slavery, right? And save the Union in the process, right? These are all the things they're trying to signal with the songs they're singing. So it's a really interesting dynamic where, like, all this stuff that we've already been talking about is, like, already going on. But then once you, like, inject, freed people into it, that dynamic kind of changes, right? They're doing all the same things that I mentioned white people are doing, but they're doing it a little differently and with different goals, right?
Right. Oh, gosh.
I just wanted to take a moment to point out a dynamic that I thought was really interesting, that it kind of brings to light in a historical sense something that we've talked about, Lynn, when people are researching, and that is the importance of engaging with people who are actually, like, part of the community that you may be writing a book about. Right, because we've talked about this in terms of, like, the descendant communities from particular, plantations and all of that kind of, and like their household histories and family histories, and making sure that is all incorporated, because what you miss as a missionary there is, like, this is music, right? But your definition of music does not include a whole subset of what was actually taking place, and you don't know what you're looking at. Right. So you can't even tell that you're missing something. So, like, you can come in with the best intentions. That's such an interesting thing that it's like a small encapsulation of that dynamic.
And that plays out in the Army too, because of course all these Black units in the Civil War, they all have white officers, right? You couldn't have a Black officer, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And so what these white officers are, they also react to this music. And it depends on what they bring to it, right? So one of our main sources for Black music during the Civil War is Thomas Wentworth Higginson, whose Army Life in a Black Regiment is a really good memoir from the Civil War, where he writes about his time as an officer in a Black regiment, a white officer in a Black regiment. And he writes about the music they sang. And again, like, coming back to some of the things I said earlier, like, the way he writes about it is, like, he would, like, hide behind a tree while they were singing, and he would, like, write down what they're singing. Like, there's no way these guys didn't know he was there. Right?
Like, look at that guy behind a tree. What does he think he's doing?
Like, he's listening, right? You're like,
right. And so
let's leave the third verse out, everybody. Yeah. Skip right from 2 to 4.
Right. but so Higginson is an example of, like, a white officer who's fascinated by this music, and again has this impulse to, like, hear it and preserve it, right?
Yeah.
But the opposite is also true. You also get these white officers who are like, well, anything associated with African culture or African American culture, as we would call it now, is, like, barbaric and savage, right? So we have to, like, now that these people are free, we have to make them as much like white people as possible, right? And one of the ways to do that is they got to stop singing this music, right? So you have these other officers who do things like form them in the regiment, form these Black soldiers in the regimental bands. And, like, are like, you're going to learn how to play, a tuba, because that's going to civilize you, quote unquote, civilize you, right? Or, they will write their own music for them, and force them to sing the songs that they've written so they don't sing these other songs, right? So again, like it all depends on where you're at with like how you view African Americans, how you view music, right? Where you are on the kind of white supremacy spectrum, right? These things are all happening in the U.S. Army at once, and there's all just different people reacting to Black culture or encountering Black culture, right, in different ways. Yeah.
Huh.
Well, before we get too far in, I think, before we finish, I definitely want to make sure we talk a little bit about Lincoln.
Sure. Yeah.
And it sounds like you wrote an article about Lincoln and his relationship with music. And I think you said that, was it he couldn't sing, that he did sing, but I guess he just didn't do it well. And
he doesn't look like a guy who could sing well, just based on his portraits and
yeah, I mean, he was a wrestler. I still love that fact. He's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. But I don't like. Yeah, I guess I see him tapping his foot and like bobbing, but I just don't hear like this beautiful voice coming out.
I guess maybe there's something like Tom Waitsy about him, but yeah, he doesn't strike me as a guy who has a classically beautiful singing voice.
Right, but he still sang. Is that? Am I interpreting this correctly?
Yeah, Lincoln was apparently a big music fan. So, most of the research I did for battle hymns I did in grad school. I mean, I've continued to write about music since then, but most of that work, battle hymns was a revision of my dissertation. So then after I got out of grad school, I started working for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum. Right? I've been here for 14 years in different jobs. So then I'm starting to work with Lincoln, right? So so I was like, oh, I should start researching Lincoln in music because like that's my thing. And what I discovered was Lincoln is in a lot of ways like a great case study or a great example of a lot of what we've already been talking about, where like Lincoln is a guy who's he's born into the folk tradition on the in Kentucky and Indiana frontier. So he engages in that. And then over time, as the American music industry grows, Lincoln becomes increasingly engaged in it. Because he's the basic thing you asked is right. He's a huge music fan. He apparently likes to sing. He apparently couldn't sing very well. He likes to sing, couldn't play any instruments. But he's a big music fan. He likes all these songs. Everyone who knows Lincoln talks about how much he liked music. And then when he becomes president, he engages with music a few times. And then he also becomes the subject of music. So, you're right, Lynn. I published an article recently about Lincoln's taste in music. And then before that, I published a book chapter about music about Lincoln, because it evolves over time too, and reflects the way people see Lincoln. So music is not just a thing that Lincoln is really into and engages with himself, but he then becomes a musical commodity himself as well, right? Both during and then after, his assassination. More songs are written about Lincoln in the immediate aftermath of his assassination than during his entire life before that. Right?
Right.
That's one of the main ways people, I mentioned earlier, music industry, right? People want to engage, they want to sort through their emotions, or they want to express their grief about Lincoln, so they go buy a song. Right? So there's just all these songs about Lincoln written after he dies. So lots of kind of complex, interesting musical stuff going on with Lincoln as well. But he couldn't sing at all. Yeah.
And he did like minstrelsy. How do you think he... So, I mean, I don't know if you can answer this, but, I think you know Lincoln pretty well. You've probably gotten into his head a little bit. So how do you think he was when he was looking at minstrelsy? How do you think, was he seeing it as, it's about white supremacy? Was he seeing it as comical? How do you think he was interpreting it?
It's really tough to answer that question. Yeah. So the kind of basic answer to your question is, I talked about what a fan Lincoln of what a music fan Lincoln is. But what does that really mean, right?
Right.
And what that means is, in Lincoln's case, I think to his credit, Lincoln doesn't care what he's listening to. So I mentioned earlier there are these forces in the mid-19th century trying to categorize music and say some forms of music are culturally acceptable,
right.
Which is coded like white European, aristocratic music, right? And then some forms of music are not, and so that's like popular music, but also like quote unquote ethnic music. And then of course like black music, right? These things are not culturally acceptable, right? Lincoln seems to have had none of that in him. Lincoln, if you put something in front of Lincoln and he liked it, he knew what he liked. And like people who write about Lincoln Right, and one of the things about Lincoln that makes it easy for you to like research someone like Lincoln is after he dies, he's the most famous American who ever lived. So everyone who ever knew Lincoln either writes about him or like does an interview about him.
Right.
And when they talk about Lincoln in music, they all say this about him. And of course, depending on where they are on the spectrum of how they feel about music in class,
right.
They'll either be like judgmental for Lincoln, like, yeah, one of the problems with Lincoln is that he couldn't tell what music was good or bad, right? Like they'll say it like that. Or they'll be like, yeah, it was wonderful. Lincoln loved all kinds of music, right? It depends where they're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And so minstrelsy is a popular style of American music in Lincoln's time. So like, that's the one way to answer it is, well, Lincoln likes minstrelsy because everybody, well, at least every white person likes minstrelsy.
Right.
And he's participating in American culture, right? But I also think we know Lincoln is a deeply intelligent person who is thinking all the time, particularly in the 1850s and 1860s, about African Americans and freedom. And, Lincoln is clearly having arguments with himself during that time about the future of America and is like a biracial America without slavery even possible. These are all questions Lincoln's asking himself. Surely if Lincoln hears a song like Oh Susanna or something like that, he has to be thinking about the racial elements.
Right.
So what does that tell you about Lincoln? I mean, it's hard to say. Certainly what it tells you is that Lincoln was at least capable of the kind of casual racism of his age, right? That if Lincoln thinks minstrel songs are funny, that means he has to at least to some degree be buying into the idea that like, boy, don't, again, please, I'm putting scare quotes around this, right? Part of the joke of minstrelsy is like, boy, aren't black people weird, right? Like that's part of the joke of minstrelsy, right? And Lincoln clearly must be buying into that at least a little bit. So it's showing that he's at least engaging in that passively, if not actively.
Right.
Obviously there's all these arguments out there about how racist was or wasn't Lincoln, and we can go down that rabbit hole.
And today we're going to get to the definitive answer.
Yeah. Right.
Dr. McWhirter with the final word.
But it at least shows me that he is at least somewhat capable of, the man is not squeaky clean when it comes to racism, because minstrelsy does not offend him. And what's really interesting about Lincoln is the only two times Lincoln actually mentions music in his own correspondence. It's minstrelsy both times. He writes a letter to Mary. The less obscure, or the more obscure time, the more obscure time is he writes a letter to Mary when Lincoln's a congressman. Mary comes to stay with him originally. She moves to D.C. with him. And she hates being there because they're in this tiny little apartment together and she's got two kids. So Mary takes off after a while and goes and lives with her dad, her slaveholding dad, in Lexington, Kentucky. And she and Abraham write these letters to each other. And they're really the only surviving, like, quote-unquote, love letters between them. And they're really fascinating for that reason, but that's not what we're here to talk about. I love talking about those letters. But in those letters, you can see they're a couple because he's like, they're talking about inside jokes. They're gossiping about Mary's parents and stuff. But one of the things Lincoln says is he talks about how he has just gone back to see the Ethiopian serenaders, which means minstrels, right? That she and him went to see together.
Oh.
And then he cracks a bunch of jokes about it where like some congressman is there with a prostitute or something. Like he's gossiping with her about what he saw at the minstrel show. He doesn't really talk about the minstrel show itself. But he's revealing that he and Mary went to minstrel shows in Washington, D.C., right? Like, so Lincoln and Mary are paying to go see minstrels perform in Washington, D.C. And then the more famous story is one of the last speeches Lincoln ever gives is after Richmond falls and he comes back from Washington, right? He gives that speech saying that Dixie, that he always liked the song Dixie, and that now that the Confederacy is collapsing, right, because it's become the unofficial anthem of the Confederacy, now it is a national song again. And so he's using Dixie as a symbol for reconciliation.
Interesting.
But look at the lyrics of Dixie, right, that you mentioned before. Like, Dixie is about an enslaved person who wants to go back to his plantation. So, like, I don't know that Lincoln is thinking about it that deeply when he says that, but nevertheless, he's using a minstrel song to try to foster national unity after the Civil War, right? And so minstrelsy is clearly something Lincoln is engaging with and he's thinking about. And I think, we have to really, we shouldn't give him a pass on that, right?
I know.
I know. I wish we could.
We mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when you were talking about how people complained about Lincoln not be, like he was into both whatever
Right.
kind of music, or like both
Right.
high and low class music. I was like, what's a modern analogy? I'd be like, yeah, he was so smart, but he just was really into Milli Vanilli for some reason. You know? Like I could never really figure that one out.
His one flaw.
Yeah.
We're going to listen to Nickelback. Yeah.
Yeah. He was like, yeah, he loved Creed.
Yeah.
I just don't. Always in the car with the Creed.
You can't vote for this man.
And he's that way about everything, right? Like he gets assassinated at a like goofy comedy about this like American who inherits an estate in England,
Right.
and it's like a fish out of water comedy, right? Like, you know, that's just who Lincoln was. Like Lincoln will read Shakespeare one day, and then some like super goofy thing the other. Like he just clearly had no, you know, which is great. Like I think that's admirable, right? Like
Absolutely.
I mean, I try to be the same way. You know, don't get in your own way, right? Lincoln knew what he liked. He liked all different kinds of things. But sometimes in the 19th century, especially, that can get you into trouble because a lot of American popular culture is super racist, and Lincoln starts engaging with that, right? And so I think some of that's what's going on. Yeah.
So, but was his taste like exclusively, you know, is that the only engagement with black music that he had was minstrelsy? Or did he listen to any, or did he encounter any of the other, you know, real black songs that we had talked about earlier?
Yeah, so Lincoln does, right? He's, you know, we talked about all these white observers who encounter black music and are kind of either struck by it or they reject it, right?
Right.
And so there's this really fascinating book about Lincoln called They Knew Lincoln, which is all reminiscences that this guy named John Washington collected of African Americans who had like encounters with Lincoln, and so it's all oral history, but they're remembering encounters they had with Lincoln.
Oh wow!
And and it was just recently republished. Kate Mazer up at Northwestern, who's a wonderful historian, re-edited it, and it's full of these really fascinating stories about Lincoln. And one of the stories is from this woman. And I don't know how to pronounce her name. Her name is Mary Dines, or Dines, Dines, which I always think is ironic because she was one of the chefs at the White House, and her name is Dines.
She dines.
But either the White House or at the Soldiers' Home, which is kind of the Lincoln Cottage where he goes off sometimes, like his Camp David.
Right.
So she's a chef for Lincoln, but in this instance, what she's recalling is she also a lot of the black staff, the African Americans who worked in the White House, were involved in the whole contraband camp movement we talked about. So they're setting up these camps, right? There's two big camps in DC, I want to say, and they're being paid for, you know, through philanthropy. I mean, the army is running them, but they're being paid for through philanthropy. And these African Americans are going out and they're collecting money and they're helping with it. So Mary Dines is one of the people working in one of the contraband camps. And Lincoln, she recalls that Lincoln comes to visit one time. And one of the things she does there is she runs the chorus of singers. And so she gets the chorus to perform for Lincoln. And Mary Lincoln is there too. And the music they perform is very much what I mentioned earlier. It's a mix of what, you know, to oversimplify it, white and black songs, right? So they're performing songs that Lincoln would have known, but they're also performing songs that he wouldn't. They're all they're what we would call spirituals. So I'm trying to remember. I think they perform "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen for Him," and a few others. And according to Dines, Lincoln starts singing along. He respects, you know, he stands there at attention while they sing these songs. Apparently he weeps, and like he's really moved by it.
Right.
And he comes back again. He comes back subsequently for another performance because I guess this contraband camp is on the way from the White House. I don't know the DC geography of the war that well, but it's on the way from the White House to the Soldiers' Home. So it's while he's going back and forth. So he stops again and asks them to perform again, and they do, and he has the same reaction.
Oh wow.
And she says, I'm going to mangle the quote, so I encourage you to look it up, but she says something like, at that moment, you know, he wasn't the president. He was just one of us, you know, here performing. So you know, we talked about Lincoln and minstrelsy and how that complicates the way we think about Lincoln and race. But a good counterpoint to that, though, is then when Lincoln encounters actual African-American music, African-American culture, he meets it right where it is, right? And he's respectful to it. He engages in it. And it seems to have like a real emotional impact on it. So, I mean, unfortunately, you know, this is true of everything with Lincoln. Lincoln gets assassinated in April 1865. So, you know, maybe there would have been more of these kind of, you know, we would know more about this kind of engagement that Lincoln was having with actual, you know, Black life and Black culture. Maybe that would have continued. But that one story, I mean, that's a pretty powerful, I think, story. And again, tells you, and also speaks to what we said earlier, where Lincoln is just like, oh, I like this, right? Like Lincoln is, when Lincoln approaches culture, he doesn't seem to have many biases. He seems to just be,
he can just take it
respectful
openly.
of it and enjoys it.
Yeah.
So I think that's what's going on there. Yeah.
May we all aspire to be intelligent, simple people like he was.
Right? Be open about it.
Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
Uncomplicated. Yeah. That's I think that's a great story to you know, button up the conversation. It's a pretty moving moment to describe. And if you're interested in taking a look at that, we will have all links to the books that we referenced and stuff, including Dr. McWhirter's book,
of course,
in our show notes.
Yes.
But Lynn, do you want to ask that our typical or usual final question there about any history fans?
Oh, yes, of course. So Isaac started this, and I love it. He says, and I agree, but I'm giving him credit, I'm not stealing it, is that wherever you live, you're probably an hour, maybe an hour and a half from a really good either historical site or museum that's small, that needs more visitors. And so we always ask our guests, what would you recommend? So maybe someone who's interested in music in the Civil War, is there a museum they could go to? Obviously, they could, you know, if they're interested in Lincoln, I mean, certainly they can visit you at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. But where else would you send them to?
I don't have a great recommendation for music, unfortunately. I wish I did. But yeah, I guess I need to give us... Huh?
Could be non-musical. Could be just
generally. I think I'm here in Springfield, and I'm a public historian in Springfield, so I should be an advocate for Springfield. So, and I'm standing in the Presidential Library right now. So, yes, thank you for plugging it. And yes, please come see us here. One of my jobs here is I curate all the objects that go on display, and I get to write the interpretation for them or whatever. And it's a real pleasure to work with this collection. So if you come visit the museum, please pay. There aren't a lot of objects. We're not an object-driven museum. But the ones that are there, that's kind of my purview. So please have a look and engage with them. We have cool stuff here. But my Springfield answer is, when people come to Springfield, they tend to do three things. They spend one day in Springfield, and they go to the Presidential Library, they go to the Lincoln Home, and they go to Lincoln's tomb, right? Because Lincoln is buried here too. And all three of those sites are great, and I strongly recommend them. But there is this whole kind of second level of sites here in Springfield that are really cool. That I think you could do another day or more. You know? So the ones I would recommend the most are actually two historic homes here in Springfield that are really cool. The Lincoln-related one is called Edwards Place, which is run by the Springfield Art Association. And the Edwards family was a family that the Lincolns were very close to. Mary's sisters married into that family. The Lincolns were married in the parlor of the original Edwards home. That home is gone now. It's where the state capitol is now up on the hill. But the family ended up having this home, which is now on the north side of Springfield. And it's been preserved for years and years and years. The Springfield Art Association does an awesome job preserving it and giving tours of it. And they have a wonderful collection too. And among the things in their collection, this is how I'll get music in. Among the things in their collection are the Edwards family had a piano. They had a piano, and it was, according to the family, it was used during the wedding of Abraham and Mary Lincoln and their parlor. And that piano survives. And actually, one of the great kind of honors I had here is right after I moved to Springfield, I've been in Springfield a little over 10 years now, they refurbished that piano so it could actually be played.
Oh, wow.
And they invited me to go over, and we did a program where I would talk about songs from Lincoln's time, and then they would play them on that piano.
Oh, neat.
And that was so cool. And that piano is still there. So the piano is there, and then the couch, the quote unquote courting couch that Abraham and Mary hung out on when they were dating
Scandalous.
is still there as well. So you can see those two.
Scandalous.
And then leaving Lincoln behind completely, the other historic home here in Springfield that is really cool is the Dana Thomas house, which is a Frank Lloyd Wright home, and was designed for this kind of socialite woman in town named Susan Lawrence Dana, who in the early 20th century, when you didn't have a lot of powerful women in a city like Springfield, and she was super influential. She was involved in helping the Black community here in Springfield, and she was a big proponent of visual arts, which is why she got Wright to design the house for her. But the thing about it is, he designed it in a way that he didn't want any art hung on the walls. So all the walls are at angles. You can't actually hang art from the walls. He had to make her all these tables to put on it.
Huh. Very specific and strange thing to design the house around. Yeah.
Yes, but it's a really, like, it's this amazing house. It's got all these different levels. The way the way it's laid out is really cool. It's really a treasure of Springfield that nobody knows is here. These Wright homes are all over the place, and people tour them, but like nobody knows there's one here, and it's been like perfectly preserved. Cool. So that would be my other thing here in town for people.
Very cool. Yeah. So if you're in and around the Springfield area or coming through, make sure you hit up those spots.
Absolutely.
They sound wonderful.
Yeah,
I'm sure my next trip through Indiana, I will make sure I make a stop there. But that sounds great. And just wanted to also, for our listeners, do you that want to keep up with your research or any work that you're doing, do you do social media at all? Do you have a website, or is it just mostly the museum where they should go and find?
Well, like a lot of people, I recently left Twitter.
The social site formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah. So I'm actually not that active on social media right now. There is a AOPLM, the Presidential Library, has a blog that I write for occasionally. I haven't in a while, but if you're interested in reading, I wrote pieces pretty regularly, and I hope I will again. I've just got too many other things going on right now. I used to write artifact spotlights, where I'd write these little 1,000-word pieces on different objects in the collection and kind of what they mean and that sort of thing. So if you want to go to our website, you'll see it right up at the top, the blog. You can dig into those and follow some of the work I'm doing here. Oh. And then, otherwise I'm just out there still writing stuff and presenting whenever I can. So come check me out if I'm around.
Fantastic.
Very cool. Yeah. Very cool. And as always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So be sure to check out patreon.com/primarysourcemedia if you'd like to support the show and enjoy this conversation. You can also catch this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts via audio, and video versions are available on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/primarysourcemedia. And Dr. McWhirter, thank you so much for being here. Wanted to thank you and apologize to our audience for having a Canadian on the program. We didn't know.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again.